I am presenting Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, November 3rd, 2024. The lesson is entitled Jonah Repents. Lesson text comes from Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Related scriptures are 1 Kings 8, 27 through 30, Psalms 39, 7 through 13, and 88, 3 through 9, Isaiah 45, 20 through 22. The place is the Mediterranean Sea. The time is about 780 BC. We saw in last week's study that Jonah is not just an exciting story for children of how a big fish swallowed a man and spit him out. It is also a book about God's love. We see God's love in every part of this account. Last week's study focused on how God's love sometimes leads him to discipline us. In this week's lesson, we note how God's love protects those he disciplines. What magnificent love God shows us. Today's aim, facts. To understand that God provides protection for his people, both physically and spiritually. Principle. To recognize that God's love leads him to protect us while he disciplines us. Application. To understand God's means of protection from spiritual danger. Illustrating the lesson. God protects us from spiritual dangers. Practical points. 1. God's grace is evident as he helps us through the consequences of disobedience. Jonah 2:1, 2. There is no place too distant and no trouble too severe that our prayers cannot reach the ears of God. Verse 2. 3. Believers benefit from God's discipline as they acknowledge their guilt and submit to God. Verse 3. 4. God's ultimate goal in discipline is to bring our hearts back to him. Verses 4 through 6. 5. When life is difficult, we should reach out to God, who always hears us. Verse 7. 6. As you go through difficulties, remember that God has already prepared your deliverance. Verses 8 through 10. Golden text. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came in unto me, into thine holy temple. Jonah 2:7. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is accepting the situation. Jonah 2:1 through 4. The second is changing his thinking. Jonah 2:5 through 7. The third is knowing God's love. Jonah 2:8 through 10. Introduction. Chuck Swindoll once related the following. Depth, not length, is important. When the Gettysburg battleground became a national cemetery, Edward Everett was to give the dedication speech, and Abraham Lincoln was asked to say a few appropriate words. Everett spoke eloquently for 1 hour and 57 minutes, then took his seat as the crowd roared its enthusiastic approval. Then Lincoln stood to his feet, slipped on his steel spectacles, and began what we know today as the Gettysburg Address. No more than 2 minutes after he had begun, he stopped. His talk had been so prayer-like, it seemed almost inappropriate to applaud. Don't underestimate 2 minutes with God in prayer. Jonah 2 is a record of the short but rich and heartfelt prayer Jonah uttered from inside the fish that swallowed him. Accepting the situation. Jonah 2:1. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, verse 2, and said, I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. Verse 3. For thou hast cast me into the deep, in the midst of the sea, and the floods compassed me about. All thy bows and thy waves passed over me. Verse 4. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. Praying in the fish, Jonah 2:1. This is the first time we read about Jonah praying, even though he had previously received direction from God. What we have seen so far is a prophet who was not receptive to God's leading and will in his life. This is difficult to comprehend, for the Lord's Old Testament prophets and their ministries are generally presented in a positive light. This serves as a warning to guard against selfish and sinful attitudes and actions in our lives. The encouraging note, however, is that Jonah's prayer reveals some spiritual growth and maturity. We cannot tell exactly what got hold of his heart and brought about change. Up to this point in time, Jonah had been fleeing from God and trying to hide from him. Now, during his time of great stress, he sought him. Did his near-death experience, the miraculous storm, or the conditions inside the fish cause him to realize how disobedient he was being and give him a healthy fear of God? Dr. Tom Constable notes, one possibility, being willing to die by drowning was one thing, but death by gradual digestion was something Jonah had not anticipated. Sometimes God puts us in a situation that is so uncomfortable that we turn to Him in desperation. If we respond in a godly manner, we will grow from it instead of turning bitter and moving further from Him. Whatever the turning point was, the events God brought upon Jonah caused the disobedient prophet to reach out to him. No situation is ever completely hopeless for God's children. We are assured several times in His Word that nothing is impossible for Him. Matthew 19:26, Luke 1:37. Even when our disobedience causes the situation, He reaches out and is ready to act on our behalf. Crying out to God, Jonah 2:2-3. Jonah's prayer was not for deliverance. It was a prayer of thanksgiving for not drowning. He faced certain death when he was thrown into the sea, so when the large fish swallowed him, it was a spectacular rescue. Verse 1 reminds us that the Lord was still Jonah's God, so it was to Him that Jonah prayed. He cried out to Him because of the affliction he was experiencing. Jonah's description of his surroundings includes the belly of hell, the deep, the midst of the sea, the floods, and all thy bows and billows and thy waves, verses 2-3. Putting all the phrases together gives us the impression of being buried alive in the sea. It portrays an impossible and hopeless situation unless God steps in. The word translated hell refers to Sheol, the place of the dead. It is often translated as grave, hell, or pit. It is the deepest of depths. Verse 2 consists of two parallel phrases, each of which says Jonah cried out to God, and He heard him. The first phrase tells why he cried, and the second tells from where he cried. Verse 3 explains the causes of this crying. God had hurled him into the sea and its depths. He did not blame the sailors, but recognized the hand of God in what had been done. Following this, he had been surrounded by the waters with no escape. Jonah acknowledged that he had rebelled against God and was deserving of the consequences. The sailors had simply been God's tools for casting him into the sea. Reasoning about the future. Jonah 2:4. The verb in verse 2 is cried. In the Bible, the word often captures one's efforts to call on God. In verse 4, the verb said suggests that Jonah is now conversing with the Lord. Here, a major turnaround in his thinking is evident. After acknowledging that God had cast him out of his sight, Jonah expressed hope and confidence in once again being able to look toward God's holy temple. God had not abandoned Jonah in spite of what he had done, and Jonah seems to have grasped that. The reason for his assurance of restoration reminds us of Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. Yet have thou respect unto the prayer of thy servant, that thine eyes may be open toward this house night and day, even toward the place of which thou hast said, my name shall be there, that thou mayest hearken unto the prayer which thy servant shall make toward this place. 1 Kings 8:28 through 29. According to Solomon, God listens to any prayers directed toward the temple and is willing to forgive them. Verses 30, 34, 36, 39, 45, and 49. In the Old Testament, the temple in Jerusalem was the sacred place where God dwelled. Jonah had this respect for the temple. David once expressed a similar desire when he said, "But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy house will I worship toward thy holy temple." Psalms 5:7. Others throughout the Old Testament also prayed according to Solomon's pattern. Daniel 6:10. Jonah too followed that pattern, showing that he had become filled with hope in God. Changing his thinking. Verse 6. The water compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. Verse 6. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. Verse 7. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came in unto thee, into thine holy temple. Describing his condition, Jonah 2:5 through 6. Jonah reflected on what he had already been through and was continuing to experience. The waters that surrounded him were probably both those that engulfed him when he was thrown into the sea and those that kept coming into the fish's stomach. What exactly did Jonah mean when he wrote that the waters compassed me about? Even to the soul, verse 5. It could have been akin to saying he was in the water up to his neck, or perhaps he was saying that he felt close to death. He also said that the deep waters completely engulfed him so that seaweed wrapped around his head. Some of us know the uncomfortable feeling of having seaweed around our feet and legs, so we can imagine the level of discomfort he experienced when it wrapped around his head. The plunge to the bottom of the sea caused Jonah to feel like the earth was shutting him into an eternal prison. Jonah's description of his experience also seems to capture what he endured emotionally. What hope for salvation could there possibly be in the belly of a fish? If we were about to be swallowed by a huge fish, we would feel certain that we were doomed to die. It is hard to imagine what Jonah's emotional turmoil must have been like. Despite the hopelessness, he was confident God would lift him out of that pit. His prayer was ascending to Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God of Israel, remembering his God. Jonah 2:7. The word remembered indicates Jonah's changing thought patterns. We can sense the change in Jonah's spirit as he reflected on God and his faithfulness to his servants. Jonah had come to the place where he remembered the Lord, verse 7. This Hebrew word does not indicate that Jonah had forgotten God existed but now remembered him. Rather, it means that Jonah was now allowing his knowledge about the Lord to affect the way he thought and acted. Jonah reflected on the God who notices and responds to the needs of his children, and it changed his mindset. His panic had shifted into a quiet reflection on the truth he knew about God. In spite of his current surroundings, he remembered that God was faithful and trustworthy and thus able to deliver him if he so desired. Because of that, Jonah prayed to God knowing he would hear him. Prior to this, everything Jonah had experienced had been down. We saw in chapter 1 that he had gone down into Joppa after hearing God's command to go to Nineveh, verse 3. He had gone down into a ship that would take him into the opposite direction. During the storm, he was down in the hold of the ship where he had lain down to sleep, verse 5. Soon he was going down into the waters of the sea, verse 6. And inside the fish, he felt himself going down to the ocean depths, 2:6. Now Jonah said that his prayer went up into the temple of God, verse 7. When we are in hard circumstances, our natural human tendency is to seek ways to resolve them. At times, we fret and worry, seek advice from others, and search diligently for answers. Only after everything fails do we turn to God in prayer. As we grow spiritually, however, we should learn the importance of looking first to God. We must learn the value of stopping and turning things over to Him. Knowing God's love, verse 8. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. Verse 9. But I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. Verse 10. And the Lord spake unto the fish, and it vomited out Jonah unto the dry land. Upon the dry land. Comparing beliefs. Jonah 2, 8 through 9. The statement concerning the folly of trusting worthless idols provide a dark background against which God's brilliant grace is evident. No lifeless idol could effect so great a deliverance as the God of heaven who made the sea and the land. In Jonah's calmed state of mind, he was able to reflect on the worthlessness of following false gods instead of the true one. They were powerless to help Jonah. When we read in chapter 2, verse 8, that people who follow worthless gods forsake their own mercy, the Hebrew word chaste is used for mercy. This word is often used to describe God as a covenant-keeping God who will always be loyal in his relationship with his children. The word has been understood to mean loyal love. God generously offers this incomprehensible love to undeserving people. Holding on to any sort of idol means turning away from God's love. To believe in anything other than God is to walk away from a loyal God who is always faithful and true. Doing so exchanges the living Lord for worthless idols that cannot save. This is an empty pursuit. As the prophet Habakkuk declares, woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, to the dumb stone, arise. It shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Habakkuk 2, 19 through 20. Even while he was still under the stress of his horror story, Jonah's fresh realization of this truth caused him to declare his renewed desire to praise the Lord Lord and be obedient to him. Perhaps he was thinking thoughts similar to what the author of Hebrews said when speaking of Jesus. By him, therefore, let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. 13:15. Jonah's thanksgiving and determination to fulfill his prophetic calling and duties led him to declare once again that great and awesome declaration, salvation is of the Lord, Jonah 2:9. From this declaration, we can see that Jonah was back on track in his walk with God. He had tried running from him and his will, but to no avail. After recognizing the impossibility of escaping God's pervasive presence, he cried out in submission and expressed his restored determination to do what God wanted. In this effort, we will see, however, that Jonah was just as human as we are. Exiting the fish, Jonah 2:10. It had taken some time for Jonah to realize that running from God is the wrong way to live life. Sometimes we have to hit the bottom before we look up. It is a reminder that when we see our friends and relatives going in the wrong direction, we should never give up on God and what he is able to do to get their attention and to turn their lives around. God's response was to order the fish to vomit Jonah out onto dry land. After guiding the big fish to the exact spot he wanted, God compelled it to give up its traveling companion. Even this was evidence of God's sovereign hand in the situation. God provided the storm. God provided the great fish. We might even speculate that God sent a rotten mackerel to cause the great fish to spew Jonah out on dry land. Sometimes God uses the most unusual circumstances to bring his servants to comply with his loving will. In the fury of the storm and in the tribulation of the fish's belly, God's love for Jonah is brilliantly reflected in Jonah's prayer in chapter 2. Jonah's deliverance from storm and fish is God's love in action. Sometimes that love leads through hard times, but our God can be trusted. Questions. 1. What makes it unusual that this is the first time we read of Jonah praying? 2. What had Jonah been doing that was about to change? 3. What was this prayer of Jonah about, and what was it not about? 4. In what ways did Jonah describe the surroundings he was in? 5. Who did Jonah say had put him in the sea and in his present situation? 6. How did Jonah express hope for the future? 7. What were some of the things Jonah described that he was experiencing during his ordeal? 8. How did things change when Jonah started remembering God? 9. What did Jonah mean by lying vanities, and what was his opinion of them? Jonah 2:8. 10. What did Jonah decide to do, and how did God respond to him? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, November 3rd, 2024. Thank you for listening. God bless.